Thanks for joining me today, and thanks everyone for jumping onto this workshop. Today's topic is college kids. It is the middle of August, meaning students are getting ready to head back to school, and college kids are hopefully getting ready to head back to campus, back to the dorms or the apartment or the rental home on campus, which brings up a lot of insurance concerns. How do their parents' insurance apply? Does their parents' insurance apply? And what considerations do we need to be keeping in mind as we're thinking about students headed back to school? Reminder that our workshop coming up in September is about insurance rates. That's going to cover how are they developed, what impacts them, what can I do to make sure that I'm qualifying for the best insurance rate that I can, and how does that get managed over time? With that, Derek, I'm going to jump into today's workshop about college kids. Before we do that, as a reminder, this is being recorded for educational purposes after the fact. So please, if you would like to speak up, we encourage you to do so. But if you have a sensitive question that would be best addressed just between you and our team, please bring that up after the fact. Ready to roll, Derek?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, very good. Well, workshop agenda for today, we're going to break it out into two parts. The first part being auto insurance. How does that apply for college kids? Part two, renter's insurance. Do they need it? How does it work? What do we need to keep in mind for renter's insurance for college kids? It's important to understand that that's not necessarily applicable only for someone renting an apartment while they are away at school. It also applies to students that are staying in the dorms or at a rental home or something of that nature. Simply, they're staying somewhere that they do not own. So part one, Derek, let's jump in. Auto insurance. What do we need to keep in mind when we're talking about auto insurance for kids as they are headed away for college?
Yeah, well, the biggest one, Brian, that we also discussed extensively during 2020 due to Michigan's new auto insurance laws is the term resident relative. Resident relative is what the court system has used to determine whether or not someone has coverage under a specific insurance policy. Resident relative is included in the policy itself, but there's not an explicit definition of it. Instead, it's a little bit murky and it's left up to interpretation. So if someone is considered a resident relative, they are going to be covered by their parents' policy. Now, what exactly is a resident relative? You'll see here, there are two requirements for someone to be considered a resident relative of their parents and therefore covered by their parents' insurance policies. That is, number one, they are related to the named insured. The named insured is in most cases going to be the parent, the owner of the insurance policy. Since we're talking about college kids and the parents, in most cases, the child is going to be related to the named insured. That also applies to adopted children and foster children as well. Now, the second one is that they are residing with the named insured. Now, the child is living, in most cases, away at school, like Brian mentioned, in a dorm, in an apartment, in a rental home. So they're not physically residing with the parents day in and day out, but are they considered residing under the court's interpretation of that term? Well, that's a really tough one, and that has been left open to interpretation and evaluation by the court systems when this type of thing has come into play due to an auto accident. Some of the biggest factors that the courts have used to determine whether a child is or is not residing with the parents or residing somewhere else. And again, if they're residing somewhere else, there's going to be some pretty big issues. But if they're residing with the parents, the court has looked at whether that child has the parent's address on their driver's license and other legal documents. Are the parents still providing financial support for that child? Are they paying any sort of their education, maybe their insurance premiums, helping support them survive with rent money and stuff like that? Does that child still maintain a room in the parent's home? Is there any sort of chance that they will return home during college breaks, during the holidays, et cetera, and really look like a part of that family. So it's really, really subjective, and there's not one specific fact that determines whether or not someone resides with the parents or somewhere else. Brian, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's a little bit of a gray area of a defining standpoint. What we found is in your traditional situation, when a child goes off to school, most of the time they're going to qualify as a resident relative. The concern would be child has already moved out, they've got an apartment somewhere, and then they decide to go to school close to where they're living. Okay, that may be a little bit of a different scenario because they've already established that they do not reside with the parents. So it's tough to take any specific situation and apply the general rule. But for your typical child that heads off in the fall, they're living on campus, they're attending class, they come home over breaks, they still have a room and have some stuff at mom and dad's home. They use their parents' address for their documents like driver's license and tax forms and things like you said, Derek. In those situations, you can be relatively confident that that child is still a resident relative and therefore would still be eligible for coverage under the parent's auto insurance policy. And that's why this is important, right? That resident relative definition is defining when a child is still eligible to be insured on their parent's policy or when they need to have their own auto insurance policy set up, right?
Right, exactly. So I think the key here is that if a child is deemed to be a resident relative of the parents, it looks just like it did when they were in high school and living at the parents' house full time, right?
Yep, absolutely. Again, sounds funny because they're not physically residing at home while they're away at school, but as this definition lays out, the home address is really still their most permanent or most primary address, and that's where they intend to return.
Got it.
Other things to keep in mind, Derek, while I'm away at school, I probably walk to class or I ride my bike or maybe I ride the bus. Does my parents' auto insurance apply in those situations so long as I still qualify as a resident relative?
Yes, it does. It's going to continue to apply in the same way that it did before you went off to college, assuming you're a resident relative. So you borrow a car from a friend, you rent a car, you God forbid get hit while you're walking to school as a pedestrian, you're going to have coverage under your parents' auto policy in those instances.
Okay. And even if I don't bring a vehicle with me to school, maybe the school doesn't allow it or any other situation like that, I'm still going to want to qualify for auto insurance coverage under my parents' insurance policy, aren't I?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. What if I go to school out of state? I head to the West Coast, the East Coast. I get out of the nasty winters in Michigan and I go down to University of Florida. What happens then?
Well, I don't think you could get into the University of Florida, Brian, but let's pretend that you did. It's going to really look just like your family did when you were vacationing in Florida or in Colorado or in California. Your policy is still going to apply in the same manner that it did, before you went off to school out of state. Now, it's important though to keep in mind that if you are driving your vehicle out of state regularly, or you're borrowing a car or renting a car, that state's auto insurance laws are going to apply to any sort of accident that happens there. So yes, your coverage is still going to apply, but you need to be cognizant that your policy, which is going to provide Michigan coverages, might not be the most appropriate policy for someone that is routinely, walking or driving or renting a car in that other state, because that other state's laws might be much different than Michigan's laws.
Okay, got it. Perfect. Well, I couldn't get into University of Florida. I certainly can't get into some of the schools in Europe, but let's assume that I somehow did. What happens if I head overseas for a year or 2 or 3 of higher education? What about that?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. An auto insurance policy applies within the United States and Canada. So when you go overseas, you know, I'm a little bit geographically challenged, but I assume that Canada is not overseas, and therefore you're not going to have coverage under that auto insurance policy. So the same thing that we tell clients when they are traveling over to Europe or to Australia or over to you know, Asia, that they need to purchase whatever coverage they can get. If they're renting a car there, they need to rely on some sort of medical plan if they can get one while they're there, if they're hurt as a pedestrian or as a passenger of a vehicle. The auto insurance policy that they have here in the States is not going to apply overseas.
Okay, because it's applicable in the US, its territories, and Canada, correct?
Bingo.
Okay, got it. Now, I never qualified, of course, for the good student discount, but I've heard that many insurance companies do have something of that sort, which requires, I believe, about a 3.0 GPA or better in order to qualify. Is that true? And does that have any sort of impact on the insurance policy?
Yeah, and actually, just to be clear, you couldn't even qualify for the mediocre student discount. But they do have a good student discount. Some of my clients wish they had a great student discount because they've got, you know, kids that are maintaining a 4.0 GPA or something crazy like that. But yes, there is a good student discount that generally requires a maintenance of a 3.0 GPA or higher. It's not going to make you know, the auto insurance free by any means, but you will see enough of an impact that it makes it worth you know, rounding up the child's grades and giving them a little whip if they're not maintaining good grades while they're there at school.
Sure. Yep. Certainly worth the note on the insurance policy. Absolutely.
Yep.
So 4 years go by, or in my situation, 7 years go by, and eventually I limp across the graduation stage and receive my diploma. I've now graduated from college. What now? What do I need to keep in mind for my insurance, my parents' insurance? What's my situation at this point?
Yeah, that really depends on what you're going to be doing. If you've been a resident relative because, again, you were away at school, but you maintained a room in your parents' home, you used their address on your driver's license and other legal documents, et cetera, as soon as you graduate, you're no longer a student, right? So you're no longer a student away at college. You are just any other family member. If you are not going to be residing with your parents, you need your own auto insurance policy immediately upon graduation, because those exceptions for a student that's away at school are no longer going to apply to you since you aren't a student. So It really depends on what you're going to be doing. If you're going to be moving home and living with your parents, like a lot of kids will for, you know, a few years.
Like you did, I think, for what, a decade or two?
Yeah, sure, right, yep. And then if you do that, then you're okay. You're eligible to continue insured on your parents' policy. If you're not going to do that, maybe you took a job, you know, in a different city, or you're moving out of state or something like that. You need to set up your own auto insurance policy immediately upon graduation.
Got it. Great. Very helpful. So, key point of this section here is that it's very important to understand when your child can or cannot be covered by your auto insurance policy, meaning that there is going to be a cutoff point where they are no longer appropriately insured on your policy. They need to set up their own. That's, of course, when they no longer qualify as a resident relative.
That's exactly right. I want to touch on just one thing that we discussed a lot during 2020, and that's the issue of that child graduating from college and not moving in back home, but driving regularly one of mom or dad's vehicles. The vehicle is titled to a parent, but the child essentially is the you know, sole driver of it, and they've got possession of it on a regular basis, and they're no longer living with the parents. Well, what do? Can they insure a vehicle that they don't own? Because we just said previously that once they graduate, if they're not moving home, they need their own auto insurance policy. Can they insure that vehicle that's owned by a parent?
They didn't used to be able to, right?
Right. But as of July or so of 2020, most insurance companies are allowing what they call constructive ownership, and that essentially allows that child to insure the vehicle on their own insurance policy, even though it's still titled to mom and dad. So they therefore will be able to have their own coverage that's going to follow them upon their graduation, even though that vehicle is legally owned by mom or dad.
Yep. Not necessarily ideal, maybe not perfectly buttoned up, but better than the alternative of not being able to obtain an auto insurance policy.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Derek, on to part two, renters insurance. We don't often see renters insurance in place for college kids, but sometimes we do. There are some situations where it's either required or it makes sense. Let's talk just briefly about what it looks like for students that are away at college. We talked, of course, at length about the term resident relative. And guess what? It's not only in your auto insurance policy, it's similar in your home insurance policy. So there is coverage in the home insurance policy that extends to resident relatives. Often that's going to include a student that is away at school. So let's assume that that's the case, Derek. My child is away at Michigan State, at Michigan, at Grand Valley, or any other number of institutions. And they do still qualify as a resident relative because they've got stuff still at my home. They use my address for their driver's license. They come home over school breaks. How does my home insurance apply to them? Does it? And what does that look like?
Yeah, yep, it's going to apply to that student away at school. And there's really two primary coverages that that student is going to be concerned with. Number one is going to be the personal property coverage. Typically 10% of the personal property coverage on the parent's homeowner's policy is going to apply to wherever it is that that student is residing, whether it's a dorm room, an apartment, a rental home, etc. And that's going to protect their computer, their clothing, their furniture, those sorts of things from fire, smoke damage, lightning, theft, burst plumbing, those sorts of things. So
Sure.
That's obviously pretty important for a student that has almost all of their belongings in a very small constricted space in a dorm room or some small apartment or rental home.
Sure.
The other important coverage is the liability coverage. And typically 100% of the parent's liability coverage on their homeowner's policy is going to apply to that child at that college, living arrangement. So for example, if someone gets hurt in their dorm room because they left the proverbial banana peel on the floor, and that person slips and falls and bangs their head and has a concussion, there's going to be lawsuit protection provided for that student from the parent's homeowner's policy.
And you ate a lot of bananas at college, so that was a very important coverage for you to be concerned with, right?
Somehow avoided all lawsuits. So yes, but that's an important one, obviously, for anybody that is living away at school and they like to get together with friends, because the more people you have over in that apartment or that dorm or that home, the more likely there is for someone to get hurt and then for that student to end up in that lawsuit for that person's injuries or, God forbid, their death.
You certainly want the coverage from the parent's home insurance policy to extend to that.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned the personal property coverage, the clothes and furniture and sports equipment. What about the expensive laptop or the musical instruments? What do you do about those?
Yeah, well, that can sometimes be tough because a homeowner's policy can have a deductible from $250 all the way up to, we see $10,000, $15,000, $25,000 deductibles in some instances, depending on the size of the home and the coverage that's being provided. So if you've got a $25,000 deductible and that child, has a dorm fire and $15,000 of their belongings go up in smoke, well, there's no claim because it doesn't exceed that $25,000 deductible. Luckily, most people don't have that high of a deductible, but you're still talking about maybe $1,000, $2,500 or so that the student or the parents, if they're kind enough, would be covering before a claim would be paid out for the damage to that student's belongings. So what a lot of people will do is they will take some of their more expensive items that are probably higher targets of theft, things like a laptop, maybe some expensive jewelry, a musical instrument, and they will specifically schedule them on the parent's homeowner's policy. What that means is you don't just see a bucket category of personal property coverage of, let's say $250,000. You'll actually see that item specifically identified on the policy: saxophone, trombone, diamond ring, and there's going to be a value listed for that, and that eliminates the policy's deductible, and it provides a little bit more coverage than the standard policy would.
Okay, sure. Very helpful. That's great. So it sounds like, Derek, as long as I qualify as a resident relative of my parents, most of their home insurance coverage is going to extend to me. I may be okay without having a renter's insurance policy and simply relying on the coverage extension that is provided by my parents' home insurance. Why do some landlords require that every tenant has a renter's insurance policy? Give us the answer in 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, number one, they want that student to have renter's insurance, because if that student happens to burn the building down, they want to know that there's an insurance company that's going to be able to pay the lawsuit against that student for the damage that they caused to that building.
Okay,
but
that would be if I'm negligent, right? I left a cigarette burning, or I had an appliance plugged in, or I left the stove on overnight. They would be suing me because I was the cause of that fire damage to their building, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
And why would they maybe want to see your name on a renter's policy instead of just relying on the parent's homeowner's policy and you being a resident relative under that policy? Well, they don't really know all the specifics of that. They don't know what address you have on your driver's license. They don't know if you maintain a room in your parents' home, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little bit more confidence inspiring on their end to see a renter's policy set up for yourself with your name on it explicitly.
Got it. Okay, that's great. Very helpful. So key point here on the renter's insurance side of thing, there is almost always going to be coverage extension to the child away at school from the parent's home insurance, so long as the child qualifies as a resident relative. Some landlords will actually accept proof of the parent's home insurance if it's coming from the agent. They'll often ask that it come from us or from the insurance agent involved, to give them some confidence in exactly what Derek said. Hey, there is a home insurance policy in place. The family understands why this coverage applies. It's because this college student still would be considered a resident relative, and they'll accept that in lieu of having an actual renter's insurance policy. There are benefits on both sides of just relying on the easy coverage extension from the home insurance or setting up a separate renter's insurance policy. So you've got a lower deductible, you've got specific coverage for the child. There is no wrong answer. It's simply which way does the family want to make this happen, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Well, Derek, thanks for walking through this with us. That concludes our workshop on insurance for college kids as they start to head back to campus. We appreciate you joining us today. Thanks for your trust. Thanks for your business. Thanks for your camaraderie. We are here to help. So please reach out to our team. If you have any questions about how your coverage applies, what students need to keep in mind, or if there's anything that we can do to advise you on the best way to make things work, that's what we're here to do, and we are happy to help.
And if any of those college kids need a set of twins to attend a football tailgate with them, you know who to talk to as well.
Yeah, I can't imagine we're going to get the call for that one. A couple of insurance and recovered accounting guys gone insurance nerds. Yeah, bring them to the tailgate.
At least we wore different outfits today.
That's true. That works.
Brian, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And any questions, please follow up with our team. We are more than happy to connect. Insurance Twins signing out.